The demolition order wasn't a request. It was a final judgment, declaring the old glass house a blight on a world that had forgotten it. But Lena knew what they didn't, that beneath the cracked panes and creeping vines lay a secret worth more than the entire city block, a secret her grandmother had died to protect. Before we uncover what was hidden in that cellar, smash that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you were watching from. You won't want to miss what happens next. The paper in Lena's hand trembled, not from the chill of the late autumn morning, but from the vibrating fury that coursed through her veins, a helpless hot anger that had been simmering for months and was now threatening to boil over. The notice was printed on stark, unforgiving paper, the ink a cold, bureaucratic black. It used words like condemned, unsafe structure, and imminent public hazard. To the city, to the developers who loomed like unseen ghosts behind every official document, the greenhouse was just that, a liability, an eyesore, a stubborn weed in their pristine concrete garden. To Lena, it was the last tangible piece of her grandmother, Ilara. It was a cathedral of glass and memory, a place where the air still seemed to hold the scent of damp earth, jasmine, and the faint, sharp smell of her grandmother's liniment. She could still see Ilara's hands, knuckles swollen with arthritis, but fingers impossibly gentle, coaxing life from soil, her voice a low, melodic hum as she spoke to her plants as if they were her children. Lena, a single mother to a quiet, observant 7-year-old named Marcus, worked 2 jobs that barely kept their heads above the churning water of rent and bills. She cleaned offices in the sterile, silent hours before dawn and served coffee to people who never looked her in the eye in the afternoons. Her life was a blur of exhaustion and worry, a constant, grinding effort to provide a sliver of stability for her son in a world that felt determined to pull the ground out from under them. And now they were coming for the ground itself. The developers, a faceless entity known only as the Vantage Corporation, had bought up the entire block. One by one, the small, tired houses that had stood for a century had fallen, replaced by the skeletal frameworks of luxury condominiums. Only her small plot, with its modest house and the sprawling, dilapidated greenhouse, remained. They had offered her money, of course. First, a polite, almost reasonable sum. Then, as her refusal became clear, the offers grew, becoming almost ludicrous, a number with so many zeros it felt like a misprint. But Ilara's last words to her had not been about money. They had been a whispered, urgent plea, her breath smelling of chamomile tea and the encroaching sweetness of death. Don't let them take the garden, Lena. Don't let them tear it down. Everything we are, everything we will be, is in the roots. Protect the roots. Lena hadn't understood then, not fully. She thought it was the rambling of a woman clinging to her life's work. Now, standing with the final notice in her hand, the words echoed with the weight of a sacred vow. The greenhouse stood behind her, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple of the dawn sky. Most of the glass panes were gone, shattered by storms or neighborhood kids over the years. The ones that remained were clouded with grime and algae, distorting the world outside into a watery, surreal dreamscape. Ivy had claimed the western wall, its tendrils weaving through the rusted iron frame like green veins. It looked, to any rational observer, like a ruin, but Lena saw the ghost of its glory. She saw the orchids that had hung like jewels from the ceiling, the rows of strange, vibrant herbs that had cured fevers and soothed heartaches, the towering night-blooming cereus that opened its ethereal white blossoms only once a year, filling the night with a perfume so intoxicating it felt like a prayer. Her son, Marcus, appeared at the back door, his small form wrapped in a blanket, his eyes wide and fearful. "Are they coming today, Mama?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question pierced through her anger, leaving a cold shard of fear in its wake. This wasn't just about her, or her memories, or a promise to a dying woman. It was about him. If they lost this house, where would they go? The money they offered could buy them a new start, a safe place, a life without the constant threat of eviction hanging over their heads. For a dizzying moment, she considered it. She could take the check, walk away, and let the past be bulldozed into dust. It would be the sensible thing to do, the responsible thing. But then she looked from her son's worried face to the dark, silent form of the greenhouse, and Ilara's voice was there again. Protect the roots. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. She folded the notice, the crisp paper crinkling in protest, and tucked it into her pocket. A hard, defiant resolve settled in her chest, heavy and solid as a stone. They could have their paper. They could have their lawyers and their bulldozers. But they would not have this, not today. She said, her voice steadier than she felt. She walked not towards the house, but towards the greenhouse. The old wooden door groaned as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the cavernous, empty space. Inside, the air was still and cool. Shafts of pale morning light cut through the broken roof, illuminating swirling dust motes like tiny wandering stars. She walked to the center of the structure, to the spot where her grandmother's potting bench once stood, and closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of decay and life, of endings and beginnings. This was more than a building. It was a legacy, and she would not let it be erased. She would make her stand here, in this crumbling cathedral of glass and memory, and she would protect the roots, whatever the cost. She just had to figure out what exactly she was protecting. The first vehicle arrived just after 9 o'clock. It wasn't a bulldozer, not yet. It was a sleek, black sedan that glided to the curb with an arrogant silence. A man in a suit that cost more than Lena's monthly rent stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel of the driveway. He was tall and impeccably groomed, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of unshakable confidence. He was the next stage of the siege, the velvet glove before the iron fist. Lena watched him from the kitchen window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Marcus was in his room, the door closed, with instructions to stay there no matter what he heard. Quote 4, she said, opening the door just enough to speak through the crack, her body blocking the entrance. Quote for him. The man, Mr. Thorne, maintained his smile. Quote us, quote 7, she said, her voice flat. Quote, oh, he sighed, a theatrical display of patience wearing thin. Quote 9, he gestured vaguely at the house. At the looming wreck of the greenhouse, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. His words were a poisoned dart aimed directly at her greatest vulnerability, her love for her son, a life free from worry. It was everything she desperately wanted for Marcus. But Alara's face swam in her mind's eye, stern and knowing. They see value only in what can be sold. Kurusan, she repeated, her knuckles white on the edge of the door. Thorne's smile finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Quote, number 11. The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. This was the true face of the unseen force she was fighting, not just a corporation, but a system that could sign a piece of paper and declare a person's entire world worthless. Quote 12, she said, and began to close the door. Thorne put a hand on it, stopping her. His grip was surprisingly strong. Quote 13, he said, his voice low and menacing. Quote 14, she shoved the door with all her might, breaking his grip and slamming it shut. The bolt clicked into place with a sound of finality. She leaned against the wood, her body trembling, listening as his footsteps receded and the car door opened and closed. The sedan purred away, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. The confrontation had shaken her, but it had also solidified her resolve. His focus on the greenhouse, his dismissal of it as a quote, 15 felt wrong. It was too insistent. They didn't just want the land. They wanted this specific structure gone, erased. Why, the question echoed in the quiet house. She went to the back window and stared out at the greenhouse, really looking at it for the first time, not as a memory, but as a puzzle. It was a fortress of secrets, and she held no key. Then a phrase from her childhood surfaced, something Alara used to say as she worked the soil, her hands caked in black earth. A nonsensical little rhyme Lena had long forgotten. When they come for the light, seek the dark. When they come for the leaves, seek the root. It had meant nothing to her then. Now it felt like a map. When they come for the light, the greenhouse was a house of light designed to capture the sun. Seek the dark. Her eyes scanned the interior of the structure, past the overgrown weeds and broken pots, to the floor. All of it was packed earth, but in the center, where the main potting station had been, was a section of heavy slate-gray flagstones. She had helped her grandmother lay them as a child, her small hands struggling with the weight. They were cool and solid underfoot, a stable island in the sea of dirt. When they come for the leaves, seek the root. The phrase clicked into place with an almost audible snap. A root cellar. Of course. Alara had always stored her bulbs and tubers there over the winter, in the cool, consistent dark. Lena hadn't been down there in 20 years. She'd almost forgotten it existed. A new energy surged through her, a sense of purpose replacing the gnawing fear. She pulled on a pair of old work gloves and her grandmother's sturdy gardening boots, which she kept by the back door. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Quote 16, she called, her voice clear and strong. Quote 17. Pushing open the back door, she stepped out into the yard. The air was thick with tension. She could feel unseen eyes on her, from the newly built condo across the street, from the tinted windows of a car parked half a block away. They were watching, waiting for her to break. Let them watch, she thought. She was no longer just waiting for the end. She was searching for the beginning. The greenhouse door groaned in protest as she entered. Inside, the world fell away. There was only the filtered light, the smell of earth, and her grandmother's riddle guiding her forward. She walked to the flagstones, her boots crunching on fallen leaves and broken glass. She knelt down, her flashlight beam dancing over the stone surfaces, searching for a seam, a handle, anything that would grant her access to the dark below. The roots were waiting. The flagstones were heavier than she remembered, their edges sealed by years of impacted dirt and encroaching moss. There was no obvious handle or ring, just the flat, unforgiving surfaces of cold stone. Lena ran her gloved fingers along the seams, pushing and pulling, but they wouldn't budge. Frustration pricked at her. Outside, the world was closing in. The sleek black car was gone, but she knew it was just a temporary reprieve. Soon they would be back, and they would not be bringing briefcases. She needed to get in. She needed to know. Her gaze fell on a rusted trowel lying half buried in the dirt near the wall, one of her grandmother's. Its wooden handle was smooth from years of use, a perfect fit for her hand. It felt like a tool passed across time. Using the pointed tip, she began to dig frantically at the dirt packed into the seam around the largest stone. It was slow, arduous work. Dirt flew, caking her clothes and face. Her muscles screamed in protest. The sound of her scraping and panting was loud in the enclosed space. Finally, she cleared enough of the perimeter to wedge the trowel underneath the edge of the stone. She put all her weight on the handle, using it as a lever. For a moment, nothing happened. The stone was a dead weight fused to the earth. Then with a deep, groaning scrape, it shifted. A sliver of blackness appeared. The air that rose from the gap was different. It was cold and utterly still, carrying a scent so ancient it felt like a memory of the earth itself. The smell of deep soil, of stone, of things that had not seen the sun in a very long time. It smelled like secrets. With renewed determination, she worked the trowel, widening the gap until she could get her fingers underneath the stone. It was a monstrous weight. She strained, her back screaming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The stone lifted, tilted, and then she heaved it over, letting it fall to the side with a heavy thud that shook the ground. Below was a square of perfect darkness. A set of steep, stone steps descended into the earth. The root cellar. She clicked on her flashlight, its powerful beam coating a clean white cone into the oppressive black. The light revealed stone walls slick with condensation, the steps slick with a fine layer of damp moss. The air was so cold it was like stepping into a different season. She hesitated for only a second, the primal fear of dark, enclosed spaces whispering at the back of her mind. But Alara's words were louder. Seek the dark. She took a deep breath, held the flashlight like a weapon, and began her descent. Each step down was a step further away from the world above. The faint sounds of the city, the distant traffic, the rustle of leaves in the wind, all faded away, replaced by an intense, profound silence. The only sounds were her own, the scuff of her boots on the stone, the soft whisper of her own breathing. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, rectangular room. The walls were lined with sturdy wooden shelves, now mostly empty. A few dusty, forgotten glass jars sat in a corner, their contents long since turned to black mulch. An old wooden crate held a collection of rusted gardening tools. The air was thick with the smell of petrichor and thyme. She swept the flashlight beam across the space, her heart sinking. It was just a root cellar, a well-built, old, empty root cellar. What had she expected? A treasure chest? A map? The absurdity of her quest hit her with full force. She was a grown woman, a mother hiding in a hole in the ground, chasing the cryptic words of a dead woman while the real world prepared to demolish her life. Despair, cold and heavy, began to settle over her. Thorne was right. She was clinging to a pile of rotting wood and broken glass, sacrificing her son's future for a fantasy. Maybe it was time to give up, to climb back into the light and face the inevitable. She could still call them, accept the offer, salvage something from the wreckage. She slumped against the cool stone wall, the flashlight beam pointing listlessly at the floor. The silence pressed in on her, amplifying the sound of her own frantic thoughts. She was about to turn to retreat back up the stairs when her light caught something. On the far wall, behind a set of empty shelves, the pattern of the stones seemed off. While the other walls were constructed of rough-hewn, irregular fieldstones, this section was made of flatter, more uniform bricks. And one of them, near the bottom, was a slightly different color, a shade darker than the rest, as if it had absorbed more moisture. Curiosity, a stubborn flicker in the face of her despair, made her move closer. She pushed the shelving unit aside. It was heavy, but it scraped across the floor, revealing the full expanse of the brick wall. She knelt down, running her fingers over the odd-colored brick. It felt loose, her breath caught in her throat. Using the tip of the trowel, she carefully worked it into the mortar around the brick. The mortar was old and crumbled easily. She wiggled the brick back and forth. It shifted. With a final pull, it came free in her hand, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity behind it. The despair vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made her dizzy. She shone the flashlight into the hole. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried lavender and rosemary, lay two objects. One was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with age. The other was a key. It wasn't a modern key of brass or steel, but one carved from a dark, dense wood, its head shaped into the intricate form of a sprouting seed. She reached into the cavity, her hand trembling, and lifted them out. The journal was cool and supple to the touch. The key was surprisingly heavy, its surface polished to a soft gleam. They were real. This was real. The sounds from the world above seemed to start again, filtering down into her subterranean sanctuary. A low rumble, the sound of heavy machinery. They were coming back. The clock, which had seemed to stop in the silent dark, was ticking again, louder and more urgent than ever before. The leather of the journal was soft and pliant, like old skin. Lena's hand shook as she opened it. The pages were filled with her grandmother's elegant, looping script. The ink faded from black to a soft sepia. It wasn't a diary of daily events, but a collection of observations, sketches of plants, chemical formulas, and cryptic, poetic entries. It was her grandmother's mind, committed to paper. Lena sat on the cold floor of the cellar, the flashlight propped on a stone to illuminate the pages, and began to read. They do not understand, the first entry began. They walk on the skin of the world and see only what can be paved over or dug up and sold. They do not feel the deep life, the slow, patient intelligence that breathes in the dark. They are men of leaves and flowers, captivated by the fleeting beauty of the bloom. They do not respect the power of the root. The words resonated deep within her, a perfect articulation of the battle she was fighting. She turned the page. There were detailed drawings of root systems, complex and beautiful as any cathedral rose window. There were notes on soil composition, on the way mycelial networks communicated beneath the forest floor. It was the work of a brilliant, passionate scientist. But woven throughout the scientific observations were warnings, paranoid and fearful. The men from the corporation came again today. They call themselves Axiom Agro Solutions. They smiled with their teeth, but their eyes were like the eyes of locusts, seeing only a crop to be devoured. They offered me a fortune for my work, for my collection. They want to own the seeds of life itself, to patent them, to control the food that feeds the world. They want to make a product out of a gift. I sent them away, But they will be back. They do not understand the word no when it stands between them and profit. Axiom Agro Solutions. The name sent a chill down her spine. A quick search on her phone, its signal weak but present, revealed they were a massive multinational agrochemical giant, a company with a reputation for aggressive acquisitions and ruthless legal tactics. And a recent merger had made them the parent company of a new real estate development firm, the Vantage Corporation. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a coordinated attack. They hadn't just been trying to buy her land, they had been hunting for her grandmother's work. They must have suspected something was hidden here. Alara's refusal to sell, her secrecy, had marked this small plot of land as a target. A low, powerful rumble from above made the very ground beneath her vibrate. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. They had brought the bulldozer. Time was running out. She frantically flipped through the journal, searching for something, anything that could help her. Her eyes snagged on a passage near the end. If the day comes that they seek to tear down the light, the key will not open a lock of metal. It opens a lock of stone and starlight. Look for Lyra in the dark, and let the sprout find its home. The lock is not a door, but a beginning. Lyra, the constellation. But what did it mean? She scanned the cellar walls with her flashlight, the beam jumping and skittering in her unsteady hand. The walls were just stone and brick, a random, chaotic pattern. There was nothing that looked like a constellation. The wooden key felt heavy in her other hand, a lock of stone and starlight. It was another riddle, and she was out of time. The vibrations from above intensified. A loud crash echoed from the greenhouse, the sound of shattering glass, 1,000 panes breaking at once. They had started. The noise was a physical blow, a desecration. She felt a sob rise in her throat, a wave of grief for the beautiful, fragile place that was being destroyed. But grief would not save her. It would not save Marcus. It would not save this legacy. She forced herself to focus, her mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. Look for Lyra in the dark. She was in the dark. A lock of stone and starlight. She shone the light on the brick wall where she had found the journal. It was just a wall. But as she moved the beam, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faint pattern of scratches on the surface of the bricks, nearly invisible under the layer of grime and age. They were deliberate. She scrambled closer, wiping at the bricks with the sleeve of her jacket. The pattern emerged, a small parallelogram of stars with one bright star off to the side. It was a crude, hand-carved star chart. It was the constellation Lyra. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The key was shaped like a sprouting seed. The journal had said, "Let the sprout find its home." She looked at the carved constellation. The brightest star in Lyra is Vega. In the carving, one of the stars was marked with a deeper, more pronounced X. She took the wooden key. The tip of it, the quote 18, was a complex five-sided shape. She looked at the X on the brick. At its center was a tiny, almost imperceptible hole, no bigger than the head of a pin, but shaped in the same five-sided pattern. It wasn't a keyhole in any traditional sense. It was a receptacle. With a hand that trembled so much she could barely guide it, she brought the tip of the wooden key to the hole in the center of the carved star. It slid in with a soft, satisfying click, a perfect fit of wood into stone, the lock of stone and starlight. The journal had said to turn it. She gripped the head of the key and twisted. For a moment, nothing. Then a low, grinding sound began, the sound of stone grating against stone, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It was a sound that should have been impossible. A thin, vertical crack appeared in the brick wall, dark and absolute. The grinding grew louder, deeper, and the crack widened. A section of the wall, a piece about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, was slowly, impossibly receding into the darkness behind it. It wasn't swinging open like a door. It was retracting like the aperture of a camera. A new space was being revealed. The air that flowed out of the opening was different from the air in the cellar. It was not damp and cold, but cool, dry, and clean, with a faint, almost imperceptible scent of ozone and something else, something faintly floral and alive. She stood frozen, bathed in the beam of her own flashlight, staring into the newly revealed darkness. The rumbling and crashing from above, the demolition of her world, seemed to fade into a distant, irrelevant noise. She had protected the root. And now the root was showing her a secret deeper than she could ever have imagined. The hidden chamber was not large, but it was pristine. Where the root cellar was damp and earthen, this room was a marvel of careful construction. The walls were lined with smooth, dark wood that seemed to drink the light from her flashlight, and the air was cool and dry, controlled by some unseen ventilation system. But it was the contents of the room that stole her breath. Lining the walls from floor to ceiling were hundreds upon hundreds of small glass vials, held in meticulously organized racks. Each vial was sealed with wax and contained a handful of seeds. And the seeds were glowing. It was a soft, internal luminescence, a biological phosphorescence that filled the small room with a breathtaking, ethereal light. There were seeds of pale, moon-like white, seeds of deep, oceanic blue, seeds that pulsed with a soft, gentle green like the first leaves of spring. The chamber was a library of captured starlight. Lena stepped inside, her boots silent on the smooth stone floor. It felt like walking into a sacred place, a tomb and a womb all at once. On a small wooden desk in the center of the room sat a second, much thicker ledger and a single folded sheet of paper with her name, Lena, written on the front in her grandmother's hand. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it. "My dearest Lena," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the time I feared has come, and I am gone. I am sorry for the burden of this secret, but I had no one else I could trust. What you see around you is my life's work. It is my legacy, but it is not for me. It is for you and for the world." Lena's eyes, blurred with tears, scanned the page as her grandmother's words explained the impossible truth. Alara had not been just a simple gardener. She had been a world-class ethnobotanist and geneticist, a renegade who had left the cutthroat world of corporate and academic research after seeing the direction it was headed. She had spent the last 40 years of her life on a secret mission to find and preserve the world's most endangered and unique plant species. These were not just any seeds. The labels on the vials told the story. Sonoran sunpod, a desert plant, now extinct, whose pods could convert saline water into fresh water. Appalachian heartleaf, a mountain herb wiped out by blight that contained a compound that could regenerate damaged cardiac tissue. Siberian ghost root, a tundra rhizome lost to permafrost melt, capable of drawing heavy metal toxins from poisoned soil, rendering it fertile again. There were plants that could produce biodegradable polymers, plants that fixed nitrogen at a miraculous rate, plants whose nutritional value could end famine. It was a genetic ark, a priceless library of biological solutions to the world's greatest problems. And it was all here, in this impossible room beneath a crumbling greenhouse in a forgotten corner of the city. The letter continued, explaining the danger. Axiom Agro Solutions, the company her grandmother had defied, knew of her research. They didn't know the location of her collection, but they had been hunting for it for decades. They didn't want to use the seeds to save the world. They wanted to patent the genetic codes, to engineer sterile versions of the plants and sell them back to the world at an exorbitant price. They wanted to own the future of food, medicine, and ecological restoration. "They offered me a fortune," Alara wrote. "I have kept the last formal offer they made, so you will understand the nature of the beast you are fighting. Do not be tempted by their numbers. Their money is a cage. True wealth is not something you can spend, it is something you can grow." Tucked into the back of the ledger was a thick, formal document. It was a purchase offer from Axiom, dated 5 years ago. They had offered Alara a staggering sum for her quote 19. The number at the bottom of the page made Lena's vision swim. $394 million. The figure was so immense, it was meaningless. It was a weapon designed to crush any and all resistance. And her grandmother, a woman who lived on a small pension and sold herbs at the local market, had looked at that number and said no. The sheer monumental integrity of that decision settled on Lena with a crushing weight. This was the legacy, not the money, not even the seeds themselves, but the responsibility they represented. The choice between what is easy and what is right. A deafening crash from above shook the chamber. A section of the root cellar ceiling collapsed, sending a shower of dirt and splintered wood down the stone steps. The main entrance was gone, buried under tons of rubble. The world above was being violently erased. Fear, sharp and immediate, seized her. She wasn't just a guardian of a legacy anymore. She was a mother, trapped underground with her son in the house next door. She had to get out. But how? She grabbed the ledger and the letter, her mind racing. She couldn't leave the seeds. It would be the ultimate betrayal of her grandmother. But she couldn't carry them all. There were hundreds of vials. She had to choose. It was an impossible choice, a godlike decision. Which species deserved to be saved? Which potential future was the most valuable? Her eyes scanned the racks, her gaze falling on a small, unassuming set of vials in a corner rack labeled simply, Alara's Promise. The seeds inside were small and dark, unremarkable. But a note in the ledger described them. They weren't a miracle cure or a terraforming agent. They were a variety of maize, one her grandmother had bred herself. It was incredibly resilient, capable of growing in poor soil with little water, and its nutritional profile was more complete than any known grain. It was a plant designed simply to feed people, to feed the hungry. In that moment, Lena understood. The spectacular, world-changing plants were important, but the foundation of everything, the most basic human need, was food. It was the root of it all. She grabbed a sturdy canvas satchel from a hook on the wall, a pre-packed bug-out bag she realized with a jolt, and began to carefully pack the vials of Alara's Promise, along with a small, curated selection of the most critical medicinal and restorative seeds her grandmother had noted in the ledger. Each vial felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the future of millions. The sounds of destruction above were constant now, a relentless grinding and crashing. The demolition was systematic, merciless. They were not just tearing it down, they were pulverizing it, ensuring nothing remained. They were erasing a memory, but Lena knew as she slung the heavy satchel over her shoulder that they had already failed. The memory was safe. The legacy was alive, right here in her hands. Now she just had to carry it back into the light. The weight of the satchel on her shoulder was immense, a physical manifestation of the responsibility she now carried. The main entrance to the root cellar was completely blocked, a solid wall of dirt, shattered glass, and twisted metal. The air grew thick with dust, making each breath a gritty struggle. Panic began to claw at the edges of her composure. She was trapped. Marcus was alone in the house, listening to the world being torn apart around them. She had to get to him. Frantically, she shone her light around the small chamber. Her last, desperate hope fading. The room was a vault, a tomb. There was no other way out. She was about to scream, to pound on the stone walls in a fit of helpless rage, when her eyes fell upon the desk again. Beneath the ledger she had moved, a small, intricate compass rose was carved into the wood. It was beautiful, but seemed purely decorative. Yet, in the center, where north, south, east, and west converged, there was a small, almost invisible inscription. The light is not the only way out. Sometimes the way forward is to go deeper. Her grandmother's voice, another riddle from beyond the grave. Go deeper. How could she go deeper? She was already buried. She ran her hands over the stone floor, pushing against the walls, searching for another loose brick, another hidden mechanism. Nothing. It was just a solid, seamless room. Then she remembered the key, the wooden key that had opened the chamber. On impulse, she took it from her pocket and looked at the compass rose again. The center point was a tiny depression, just the size of the key's tip. With nothing left to lose, she inserted the key into the desk. It fit. She turned it. This time there was no grinding of stone. Instead, a soft, mechanical click echoed from the floor beneath her feet. She looked down. A section of the stone floor, a perfect 3-foot square directly in front of the desk, had just unlatched. It was a trapdoor. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through her. She knelt and lifted the heavy stone panel. Below, a narrow cylindrical shaft descended into absolute blackness. An iron ladder was bolted to the side. The air that rose up was cool and smelled of stagnant water and tunnels. It was an escape route. Alara, in her infinite foresight, had planned for this. She had built a way out. Lena didn't hesitate. She secured the satchel tightly to her back, took a firm grip on the cold iron rungs of the ladder, and began to descend, leaving the soft, glowing light of the seed vault behind her. The shaft was tight, claustrophobic. The darkness was total, broken only by the narrow beam of her flashlight. She descended for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the scrape of her boots and her own ragged breathing. Finally, her feet touched solid ground. She was in a narrow brick-lined tunnel, just tall enough for her to stand upright. It was an old storm drain or sewer line, long abandoned. The journal, which she had stuffed into the satchel, held the final piece of the puzzle. A hand-drawn map on the last page showed the tunnel system. It detailed a path that led west, away from her property for nearly 2 miles, eventually emerging into a storm drain that emptied into the river on the far side of town. It was a long, dark, terrifying journey, but it would take her away from the demolition, away from Vantage and Mr. Thorne. It was a path to safety. A new dilemma rose in her mind, sharp and painful. Marcus. Her son was still in the house. She could follow the map and escape, but she would be abandoning him. Or she could try to find a way back to the house to get him and risk being caught. The choice was agonizing. Her instincts as a mother screamed for her to go back for her son. But her grandmother's warnings echoed just as loudly. They will stop at nothing. If she were caught, they would take the seeds. They would take her son. The legacy would be lost, and Marcus would be left in the hands of the very people who had destroyed their home. A terrible, cold logic began to form in her mind. The safest thing for Marcus right now was for her to be gone. The authorities would be called. He would be found, taken into care. It would be traumatic, horrible for him, but he would be physically safe. If she escaped, if she got the seeds to safety, she could come back for him. With the resources this legacy could provide, with the allies her grandmother had mentioned, she could fight them and get him back. It was a gamble, a mother's worst nightmare, choosing between her child's immediate comfort and his long-term safety, between her role as a mother and her role as a guardian. Tears streamed down her face, cutting paths through the grime and dust. She looked back up at the dark shaft, towards the home that was no longer there, towards the son she was leaving behind. "Woe 20. She whispered into the suffocating darkness of the tunnel. "Dewan." It was a promise that felt like a betrayal, a vow that broke her heart. But it was the only choice she had. She turned her back on her home, on her son, and following the faint beam of her flashlight, she began the long walk into the unknown, each step taking her deeper into the darkness, further from everything she had ever known, carrying the fragile, glowing hope of the future on her back. The journey was a nightmare of darkness and dripping water. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the next step and the one after that. The tunnel was a sensory deprivation chamber, a long black throat that had swallowed her whole. The only reality was the small circle of light cast by her flashlight, the damp, slick feel of the brick walls, and the constant, unnerving drip of water from somewhere above. The air was heavy, smelling of decay and wet earth. Every rustle, every skittering sound in the darkness sent a jolt of fear through her, visions of rats or worse flashing in her mind. But the greater fear, the one that gnawed at her soul with every step, was the thought of Marcus. She pictured him in his room listening to the roar of the machines waiting for her to come back. She imagined his confusion turning to fear, then to the heartbreaking despair of a child who feels abandoned. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight that made the satchel of seeds feel heavier with each step. Had she made the right choice? The question looped endlessly in her mind, a self-inflicted torture. There was no right choice, only the least wrong one, the one that felt like tearing herself in two. To keep herself moving, to keep the paralyzing guilt at bay, she focused on her grandmother. She tried to imagine Alara in this tunnel, planning this escape route. The meticulous foresight, the quiet determination it must have taken was staggering. Her grandmother had not been a victim. She had been a fighter, a strategist who had prepared for the worst while cultivating the best. Lena had to be a fighter too, for Alara, for the legacy, for Marcus. The tunnel forked twice, just as the map in the journal indicated. Without it, she would have been hopelessly lost in the labyrinth beneath the city. Hours bled into one another. Her flashlight beam began to flicker, the batteries dying. A new, more primal panic set in. To be left in this darkness, truly blind, was a terrifying prospect. She started to ration the light, switching it on for a few seconds to get her bearings, then plunging ahead in near total blackness, one hand trailing along the cold, slimy wall. During one of these dark intervals, as she felt her way forward, her hand brushed against something that wasn't brick. It was a small wooden panel set into the wall. Her fingers found a latch. Her heart pounded. This wasn't on the map. Was it a trap? Another way out? Her curiosity warred with her fear. She had to know. She switched on the flashlight, its beam now a pathetic, sickly yellow. The panel was a small door, barely 2 feet high, a maintenance hatch of some kind. She pulled the latch and opened it, peering into the space beyond. It was a small, dry chamber, not unlike the one where she had found the journal. And in the center of the floor was a single metal box with the note taped to the lid. For the journey. Her grandmother's handwriting. It was another contingency, another breadcrumb on the trail Alara had laid for her. Inside the box were fresh batteries for the flashlight, several sealed packets of dried fruit and nuts, 2 bottles of water, and a small, tightly wrapped oilcloth package. Lena unwrapped it. Inside was a stack of cash, several $1,000s in used 20s and 50s, and a simple pay-as-you-go cell phone, fully charged. A wave of overwhelming love and gratitude for her grandmother washed over her, so intense it brought her to her knees. Even in death, Alara was taking care of her. She was not alone in this tunnel. Her grandmother's foresight, her love, was with her, lighting the way. She quickly changed the batteries in her flashlight. The bright, strong beam that sprang into life was a resurrection, chasing the oppressive darkness back to the corners of the tunnel. The food and water were a godsend, and the money and phone were a lifeline to the world above. She now had a chance, not just to survive, but to fight back. Bolstered by this discovery, she continued her journey with renewed purpose. The path began to slope upwards, and the air started to change. The scent of stagnant water was slowly replaced by the smell of rain, of wet pavement and river water. She could hear a faint, distant rumble that wasn't machinery, but the sound of traffic on a bridge. She was getting close. The end of the tunnel was not a grate, but a wide concrete outfall, partially obscured by a curtain of overgrown ivy. Peeking through the leaves, she saw the gray, churning water of the river just a few feet below. On the far bank, the city skyline rose against a sky that was no longer dark, but a deep pre-dawn indigo. She had walked through the night. She had made it. She checked the burner phone. There was a single contact saved in it. A name, Dr. Eris Thorne, and a number. Thorne? The name was a shock. It was the same as the developer, the man in the suit. It had to be a coincidence. The journal had mentioned a community of trusted scientists. Was this one of them? A brother? A cousin? Someone working against the family name? It was a risk, but it was the only lead she had. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the cool morning air, the first fresh air she had tasted in what felt like a lifetime. She was covered in dirt and grime, her muscles ached, and her heart was a hollow wound. The greenhouse was gone, her home was gone, her son was alone. To the world, she had lost everything. But as she clutched the satchel of seeds, she knew she held the future in her hands. She was no longer just Lena Adams, a struggling single mother. She was a guardian, a fugitive, the keeper of her grandmother's promise. She found a sheltered spot under the bridge, out of sight, and dialed the number. The phone rang twice, then a man's voice, calm and professional, answered. "This is Iris." Lena's voice was a hoarse whisper. "My name is Lena Adams," she said, the words feeling foreign, the name of a person who no longer existed. "I'm Alara's granddaughter." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a moment of stunned silence. Then the man spoke, his voice filled with a sudden, urgent intensity. "We've been waiting for your call for years. Are they safe? Do you have the seeds?" The word "we" hung in the air, a promise of alliance. She was not alone. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger, firmer. "I have them. It's time to start planting." The man on the phone, Eris Thorne, was indeed related to the developer. He was his younger brother, a fact that Eris delivered with a tone of weary resignation. They were 2 branches of the same family tree that had grown in opposite directions. While his brother Julian had pursued wealth and power within the corporate machine, Aris had become a botanist, dedicating his life to conservation, inspired by the very work of the woman his brother was now trying to erase, Alara. He explained that Alara had been his mentor. She had secretly cultivated a small underground network of scientists, researchers, and activists who shared her belief that the world's genetic heritage belonged to everyone, not to corporations. They called themselves the Root Network. And for years they had been preparing for this day, the day Alara's collection would need to be moved from its sanctuary. Aris gave her an address, a safe house on the rural outskirts of the city. He told her how to get there without being seen, a series of bus routes and back roads that would keep her off the main grid. He warned her that Julian and Axiom would be looking for her. Now that the greenhouse was gone and the seeds were not found in the rubble, they would know she had them. She was officially a fugitive, a person of interest to a corporation with near-limitless resources. The first step was to transform herself. Using the cash her grandmother had left her, she bought clothes from a thrift store, nondescript jeans, a hoodie, a baseball cap, and a pair of sunglasses. In the restroom of a gas station, she washed the dirt and grime from her face and hair, looking at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, her eyes older, harder, etched with a fear and resolve that hadn't been there 2 days ago. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of her own life. The bus ride was agonizing. Every person who glanced her way, every police car that passed, sent a spike of pure adrenaline through her. The satchel on her lap felt like a bomb, both precious and incredibly dangerous. She kept her head down, the bill of the cap pulled low, and focused on the rhythmic motion of the bus, the blur of the world outside. Her thoughts, as always, returned to Marcus. She imagined him being questioned by social workers, by police, a missing mother, a demolished home. What would they be telling him? What would he be thinking? The pain of it was so sharp, so physical, that she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. She had to trust that she had made the only choice she could. She had to believe that this sacrifice would one day lead her back to him. The safe house was an old, isolated farmhouse at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by acres of overgrown fields and dense woods. It looked deserted, but as she approached, the front door opened. Iris Thorne was not what she expected. He was younger than his brother, with kind, intelligent eyes and the calloused hands of someone who worked with the earth, not with spreadsheets. He greeted her not with suspicion, but with a look of profound relief and reverence. He said, his voice gentle. Inside, she met the other members of the Root Network who had gathered. There was a wiry, energetic soil scientist named Ben, and a calm, methodical geneticist named Dr. Anya Sharma. They were the core of the team Alara had trusted. They treated the satchel of seeds with the awe and care of archaeologists handling the Dead Sea Scrolls. As Anya began the delicate process of cataloging the vials, checking the viability of the seeds under a microscope, Iris sat with Lena at a simple wooden table, a steaming mug of tea between them. He told her what was happening in the world she had left behind. The demolition of her property was a minor story in the local news, a routine urban renewal project. But a missing persons report had been filed for her, and Marcus was in the custody of Child Protective Services. Julian is pulling strings, Eris explained, his expression grim. He's framed this as a case of maternal neglect and abandonment. He's trying to use your son as leverage to smoke you out. The news was a punch to the gut, but it was what she had expected. Can we get him back? She asked, her voice trembling. We will, Eris said with quiet confidence. But we have to be smart. We have to be patient. Right now, the most important thing is the legacy you're carrying. We need to secure it. Then we build our case against them and we bring you and your son back together. The plan was to disperse the seeds. The collection was too valuable to keep in one place. The Root Network had safe locations all over the world, hidden labs, remote agricultural communes, university archives with sympathetic directors. They would clone the samples, create a decentralized, redundant network so that the collection could never be lost or seized. Lena's role, they explained, was now more important than ever. She was not just the courier. She was the key. Buried deep in Alara's research, in the thick ledger she had brought with her, was the final brilliant security measure. Anya Sharma found it late that night, her cry of discovery bringing them all running to the makeshift lab they had set up in the farmhouse's basement. Alara had engineered a unique genetic lock into the most critical species, including Alara's promise. The seeds contained a dormant retrovirus. To activate germination and unlock the plant's full genetic potential, it required a specific enzymatic trigger. An enzyme that was only produced by individuals with a direct maternal link to Alara's own mitochondrial DNA. The seeds were coded to her bloodline. Only Lena or her son Marcus could make them grow. Axiom could steal the seeds, but they would be worthless to them. They were just sterile, dormant specks of matter. Alara had not just protected her legacy with stone walls and secret tunnels. She had woven it into the very fabric of her family, into Lena's own DNA. The revelation was staggering. Lena looked down at her own hands, seeing them in a new light. She was not just a guardian of the seeds, she was a part of them. The inheritance was not something she carried in a bag. It was something she carried in her blood. The fight was no longer just about protecting a memory. It was about claiming her own identity, her own power. She was the root, the living connection between the past and the future. And for the first time since this ordeal began, the fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning, righteous anger in the dawning of a new, unshakable purpose. She had a world to save and a son to bring home. The war had just begun. The farmhouse became a command center, a hive of quiet, urgent activity. While Lena rested, recovering from her ordeal, the root network mobilized. Encrypted messages flew across the globe. Plans were made. The seeds were painstakingly divided, with small samples packed into innocuous containers. A tin of mints, a hollowed-out book, a canister of film, ready for transport by a network of trusted couriers. Lena's days fell into a new rhythm. She spent hours with Anya in the basement lab, learning the science behind her grandmother's work. She learned about gene sequencing, about the delicate process of tissue culture, and about the specific enzymatic trigger in her own biology that made her unique. It was like discovering she could speak a language she never knew she possessed. The science was complex, but the core concept was simple and beautiful: life protecting itself through lineage. She also spent time with Erfis, poring over Alara's journals, piecing together the full history of her grandmother's quiet war against Axiom Agri-Solutions. She learned that Axiom had systematically destroyed Alara's reputation in the scientific community, branding her a crank and a charlatan to isolate her. They had engineered crop blights that wiped out rare species, then patented their own GMO versions as the only solution. The story was one of staggering greed and corporate malfeasance. Quote 35. Eris said, his voice laced with contempt. Quote, as the days turned into a week, the weight of her separation from Marcus grew heavier. Eris, using a contact within the social services system, was able to give her updates. Marcus was physically safe, but he was withdrawn and quiet, refusing to speak to anyone. He was in a foster home, waiting. The knowledge was a constant, dull ache in Lena's chest. Every night she would lie awake, clutching a small, worn teddy bear she had found in his room and stuffed into her pocket before she fled, and she would whisper the same promise into the darkness. Quote 37. The first phase of the plan was to prove the seeds were real. They couldn't fight Axiom with accusations alone. They needed irrefutable proof of what the corporation was trying to suppress. They chose to start with the Sonoran Sun Pod, the plant capable of desalinating water. Iris had a contact, a respected and independent journalist named Maria Flores, who had been investigating Axiom for years but had never found a smoking gun. They decided to give her one. In the sterile environment of the lab, under Anya's careful guidance, Lena provided the final crucial element: a single drop of her blood placed in a petri dish with the sun pod seeds in a growth medium. For 2 days they waited. Lena barely slept, constantly checking the small incubator. Then, on the third morning, it happened. A tiny pale green shoot, no bigger than an eyelash, had pushed its way out of one of the seeds. It was alive. The sight of it, so small and so profoundly significant, filled her with an emotion so powerful it was almost painful. It was hope, made manifest. They documented everything. filming the germination and the plant's rapid growth. Within a week, the small shoot had grown into a thriving, vigorous plant. They then filmed the critical experiment, taking a beaker of heavily salted water and placing the plant's mature, fleshy pod into it. Slowly, miraculously, the pod began to absorb the salt, sequestering it into specialized sacs. Within an hour, the water in the beaker was pure, fresh, and drinkable. They had done it. They had proof. Eris sent the encrypted video file and a detailed brief to Maria Flores. 2 days later, the story broke. It didn't appear in the mainstream media, which was heavily influenced by Axiom's advertising dollars, but on a fiercely independent, highly respected online news outlet. The headline was explosive. Exclusive, suppressed miracle plant. That creates fresh water uncovered. Did agtech giant Axiom hide it for decades? The story went viral. It was shared millions of times, igniting a firestorm of public outrage and scientific curiosity. Axiom's stock price took a sharp dip. Their PR department went into overdrive, issuing statements calling the story a hoax, a fabrication, a smear campaign by their competitors. They denied everything. But the video was compelling, and Maria Flores' reputation was unimpeachable. The world was watching. And Julian Thorne, for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, was on the back foot. For Lena, it was the first taste of victory, a validation of her sacrifice. But it was also the moment the war went from cold to hot. She had revealed her hand. Axiom now knew without a doubt that the seeds were viable and that she was the key. They would no longer be trying to just find her. They would be hunting her. The stakes had been raised for everyone. That evening, Eris received a call. It was from his brother. Lena could only hear Eris's side of the conversation, his voice low and tense. No. Julian, you don't get to threaten me. You crossed a line long ago. Leave her son out of this. It's over. When he hung up, his face was pale. He knows I'm involved, Eris said. He's threatening to use Marcus to force you to surrender. He's petitioning the court to have him moved to a long-term facility, a place where we won't be able to get information. The threat was clear. They were going to bury her son in the system, to sever their connection permanently. The time for hiding and planning was over. It was time to fight back directly. They had proven the science. Now they had to prove the crime. And Lena knew that the proof was in the one place she never wanted to go back to, the ruins of her own home. Somewhere in that rubble in her grandmother's house must be the years of correspondence, the original research notes, the evidence of Axiom's relentless criminal pressure campaign. She had to go back. It was a terrifying prospect, walking back into the lion's den. But it was the only way to get the evidence she needed to expose Julian Thorne, clear her shame, and get her son back. The journey that had started with a descent into darkness now required her to step back into the glaring, dangerous light. Returning to her block was like visiting a ghost. The landscape was alien, transformed. Where a row of familiar, modest houses had once stood, a massive, skeletal condominium complex now clawed at the sky. The sounds of construction, the whine of saws, the clang of metal, filled the air. And in the center of it all, where her home had been, was a barren, scraped-out lot of raw earth, surrounded by a high chain-link fence. The greenhouse was gone, so completely erased it was as if it had never existed. There was no rubble, no debris, just flat, empty dirt waiting for the foundations of a new structure. The sight was a physical blow. She had expected a ruin, but this surgical removal was somehow worse. It was an act of profound disrespect, a final insult to her grandmother's memory. Lena watched from inside a parked van half a block away, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Eris sat in the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the site. Ben, the soil scientist, was in the back monitoring a laptop connected to a series of sensors. Security is tight, Eris murmured, pointing to the cameras mounted on the fence posts and the single guard patrolling the perimeter. Julian isn't taking any chances. He's probably had the site swept a dozen times. They wouldn't have been looking for paper, Lena said, her voice quiet. They were looking for the seeds. They think the prize is gone. They'll be less careful about the rest. Her grandmother, she knew, was not a fool. She would not have kept the incriminating evidence in a simple filing cabinet. It would be hidden, protected with the same ingenuity she had used for the seed vault. Lena closed her eyes, trying to transport herself back into the small house, to walk through its rooms in her memory. She pictured the living room with its worn armchair and the faint scent of lavender. She pictured the kitchen, the sun slanting through the window over the sink. And she pictured her grandmother's study, a small, cluttered room filled with books on botany and history, maps of the world pinned to a corkboard, and a heavy antique roll-top desk. The desk. It had always been the centerpiece of the room and in a fortress of wood and secrets. It had a dozen tiny drawers and hidden compartments that Lena had loved to discover as a child. Alara had once told her, quote, 46, quote, the desk had been sold with the rest of the house's contents in an estate sale she had been forced to hold a year ago to pay medical bills. The memory was a fresh stab of pain. She had sold her own history. The desk, she said, her eyes snapping open. The evidence was in her desk, but I sold it. Aris looked at her, his expression grim. To who, Lena? Do you remember? She shook her head, a wave of despair washing over her. An antique dealer. I don't remember the name. It's gone. For a moment, silence filled the van. The plan seemed to have hit a dead end. Then Ben spoke from the back without looking up from his laptop. Maybe not. He turned the screen towards them. He had been running a search, cross-referencing local antique dealers with estate sale records from her address. An image popped up on the screen. It was the desk, her grandmother's desk, photographed for an online auction site. It had been purchased by a private collector. Ben had already hacked the auction house's records. The collector's name was Julian Thorne. A cold dread washed over Lena. Of course. Julian hadn't been buying an antique. He had been buying a container, suspecting that Alara had hidden something inside it. He had the evidence. He had likely destroyed it long ago. Quote 52. Lena whispered, quote 53. Quote 54, Aris said, his jaw tight. He pointed to the delivery address in the record. It wasn't Julian's home or office. It was a high-end, climate-controlled storage facility on the industrial side of town. Aris reasoned, his mind working quickly. Quote 56. The new target was clear. They had to get into that storage unit. The plan they formulated was audacious, bordering on insane. It involved Ben using his technical skills to clone a security keycard and create a temporary loop in the facility's camera feeds. It involved Aris using his family resemblance and a forged work order to bluff his way past the front desk. And it involved Lena, the one person who knew the desk's secrets, going in with him. The night of the planned infiltration was cold and moonless. As they drove towards the storage facility, a sprawling, anonymous concrete building, Lena felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The fear was still there, but it was now a focused, cold energy. She was no longer just a victim reacting to events. She was an active participant in her own liberation. This was for Marcus. Aris, dressed in the crisp uniform of a fine art transportation company, was a convincing actor. He charmed the night manager with a story about a last-minute pickup for a VIP client, while Ben, parked a block away, worked his magic on the security system. The green light on the access panel blinked. They were in. The facility was a sterile, silent labyrinth of identical hallways and metal roll-up doors. Aris led them to Unit 34B. Lena's heart pounded as he slid the clone keycard and the heavy metal door rolled up with a deafening screech. Inside, the unit was filled with expensive plastic-wrapped furniture and sealed crates. And there in the back, under a heavy canvas tarp, was the familiar shape of her grandmother's desk. It was like seeing an old friend in a prison. While Aris stood watch, Lena went to work. She ran her hands over the familiar wood, her fingers searching for the hidden catches and secret springs she remembered from her childhood. She found the first one, a small, false-backed drawer that opened into a deeper compartment. It was empty. She found the second, a panel that released by pressing a specific knot in the wood grain. Also empty, Julian had clearly searched it. Desperation began to creep in. Had Aris been wrong? Had Julian found and destroyed everything? Then she remembered the last secret, the one her grandmother had only shown her once. It wasn't a latch or a spring. It was a sequence. A series of small, inlaid mother-of-pearl dots on the desk's surface had to be pressed in the right order. The same pattern as the constellation Lyra. She pressed the sequence. For a moment, nothing. Then, a soft click echoed from a deep within the desk structure. A section of the ornate central carving on the front of the desk swung inward, revealing a slim, lead-lined cavity. And inside that cavity was a thick manila folder. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. It was filled with documents, copies of the original letters from Axiom, detailing their offers and their threats. Lab reports, signed by a corporate scientist, confirming that Axiom had deliberately created the Appalachian heartleaf blight to eliminate the natural plant. And at the very bottom, a signed affidavit from that same scientist, a whistleblower Alara had convinced to come forward, detailing the entire conspiracy. It was the smoking gun. It was everything. She had it. As she clutched the folder to her chest, Eris's phone buzzed. It was a text from Ben. "Get out now." Silent alarm tripped at the gate. Cops 2 minutes away. They had been discovered. Julian had a secondary, hidden alarm system. They had seconds to escape before the entire facility went into lockdown, and the police arrived to find them standing over Julian Thorne's private property, red-handed. The victory had lasted only a moment before turning into a desperate race against time.